It began with just one component, a single piece in a structure that stretched 1,760 feet across the Ohio River. But the failure of that one component just before 5 p.m. on December 15, 1967, set in motion a mechanical chain reaction that would bring the entire bridge crashing down, sending dozens of vehicles and the people within them tumbling into the river below. 46 of those people would lose their lives. 2 of them were never even found. The domino effect would not end there. The collapse shattered communities on either side of the river, in Ohio to the west and in West Virginia to the east. This was not something that could be easily forgotten. The subsequent investigation changed American civil engineering forever, uncovering disturbing truths about the state of the nation's highway infrastructure and essentially overhauling its regulations. Hey, I'm Andy Roberts, and this is the story of how an ordinary commute across the Silver Bridge just before Christmas in 1967 turned into one of the deadliest road bridge collapses in American history, and ushered in a new era of safety practice and protocol. It's December 15th, 1967, the collapse. The Silver Bridge wasn't its name to begin with. It was the Point Pleasant Bridge, and it connected the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with Canauga, Ohio, around 600 meters to the west across the Ohio River. It got its more popular title thanks to the shining silvery texture of the aluminium paint that covered it. Crossing the Silver Bridge was unremarkable. It was something people did every day, heading to and from work or visiting friends and family across the state line. But on December 15, 1967, the mood on the bridge might have been a little brighter than usual. Sure, it's approaching midwinter, and even though it was not yet 5 p.m., the sun was already close to the horizon. But it was a Friday evening, another work week over and done with. It was also only 10 days before Christmas. The holiday season was about to kick into gear. With people eager to get out of work early, to go home to families, to go Christmas shopping, or just to enjoy a bit of deserved relaxation on a Friday evening, traffic was already building up on Route 35. This meant a growing number of cars on Point Pleasant Bridge. At 4:58, disaster struck. Witnesses reported hearing something like a shotgun blast or a sonic boom, an enormous release of energy emanating from somewhere on the north lane of the bridge close to its Ohio end. Some wondered what it was that they heard. They didn't have time to wonder for long. It took only 20 seconds for the shockwave to ripple across the entire span. The rat-a-tat of falling components sent the bridge tumbling like a house of cards. As it concertinaed down into the river below, it took cars, drivers, and passengers with it. There were 37 vehicles on the bridge when it came down, and 67 drivers and passengers with them. 31 of those vehicles plunged around 100 feet into the water of the Ohio River. All 6 of the vehicles to avoid the plunge were on the bridge's westbound lane, and at their head was Charlene Clark Wood of nearby Gallipolis. Charlene was pregnant at the time, exhausted after a long working day and eager to get home. She'd only ventured a few meters onto the West Virginia side of the bridge when she felt the structure shaking beneath her. "My father was a riverboat captain and had talked about barges hitting the bridge and the pier," Charlene said. "So when I heard that sound, I automatically put my car into reverse." Charlene acted just in time. When the bridge came down, she was only inches from disaster. Had Charlene not responded so quickly, her car and the 5 others behind her would certainly have gone into the Ohio River. As the bridge was so close to the town on either side of the river, many local residents on either bank witnessed it fall. Charlene Foster of Canauga was at home making dinner when her 2 young sons began screaming.
I was standing right here in my kitchen preparing dinner, and my 2 boys...
"Mummy, Mummy, the bridge is in the water!" she remembered them yelling. The bridge was just like a snake slithering down into the water, Charlene said. It seemed to go down in slow motion. Ann Davis, working at a store nearby to the bridge, described how it started to crumble and sink like a set of dominoes falling. Cars were being crushed like toys in the grinders. It was immediately obvious that a serious incident was unfolding, with multiple casualties. December 15th to 16th, 1967, the rescue. Within minutes, emergency services congregated on both sides of the Ohio River, but what they found was like nothing they'd ever seen before. The bridge's entire span lay twisted and torn in the river. Buckled metal and chunks of concrete pinned vehicles in the freezing water or crushed them altogether. Many of the cars had been completely submerged, with their occupants still inside. Ron Ackers, a reporter for WCMI Radio, recalled the harrowing scene. When the bridge collapsed, it twisted upon itself and the cars were tangled in the superstructure of the bridge, he reported. It was kind of like wringing out a cloth. There was a car that was squished down so it looked like it was 2 feet across. With so many people trapped in the freezing waters of Ohio, time was of the essence. As no specialist equipment was on hand, emergency services commandeered small boats and headed out into the channel to do what they could. Within minutes, they pulled their first survivor from the water, Howard Boggs, age 24, who was clinging to a barrel. Boggs had been crossing the bridge with his wife Marjorie and 17-month-old daughter Christy. "My feet touched the damn bottom of the river. I don't know how I came up," Howard said. "I must have blacked out again because the next thing I knew, I was hanging onto this barrel. I just hope to God that Marjorie and the baby got out okay." Tragically, both Marjorie and Christy lost their lives that day. William Edmondson from North Carolina was also among the first to be pulled from the river. He had a lucky escape when the door to his truck was torn off, allowing him to float free. He spent 10 minutes in the freezing water before being picked up. But those early wins soon began to fade. Boat crews could only get to the few people who'd fallen clear of the wreckage. The majority of victims were trapped within the twisted deck and superstructure of the bridge itself. To get to these people, the rescuers needed barge-mounted cranes, but none could be found. As the minutes ticked by, it began to grow dark and bitterly cold. The rescuers did manage to find several smaller cranes that could be set up on the riverbank, but these lacked the power required to pull vehicles out of the river. Volunteers arriving on the scene tried to lend a hand. A man with a tow truck attempted to hoist a vehicle from the river, but only succeeded in ripping off its front axle. The truck lurched forwards and the car sank back into the dark waters of the Ohio. Local divers began to converge on the riverbank, gearing up and taking the search below the water level. But the freezing temperatures and twisted debris made progress slow and hazardous. Tim Jameson was among them. He reported finding a couple dead in a car, trapped beneath a metal girder, but could not reach them. "I'd give anything to go in there and get them out," he said. "Not because it would help them any, but it's proper. A human being deserves something better than that, even if it's dead." The desperate rescue attempt continued long into the night, lit by the headlights of cars lined up along the riverbank, but it was almost impossible to reach many of the vehicles. By midnight, several hours after the collapse, newspapers were reporting that 17 survivors were being treated in nearby hospitals, and only 4 of the dead had been recovered and identified. The official figures would later record 9 serious injuries from the collapse of the bridge. Of those who actually went into the water, only 5 survived. Despite the Herculean efforts of rescuers, very few victims were making it out alive. December 16, 1967, the recovery begins. As the night wore on, those still working in the river understood they were now searching for bodies, not for survivors. The freezing December water would simply not allow anyone to remain alive that long. And so, as dawn rose on December 16th, the mission became one of recovery, not rescue. That recovery operation went on for weeks. A significant issue was that authorities initially had no idea how many cars had been on the bridge and how many people they were looking for. Slowly, the panicked flood of missing person reports began to stabilize. This gave the authorities a comprehensive picture of how many people were missing. The family of Hilda Bias at Point Pleasant and her 2 daughters, Kimberly and Kathy, clung to forlorn hope for an interminably long time. It was several weeks until the bodies of Hilda and 2-month-old Kimberly were finally discovered and identified. 10-year-old Kathy was never found. Like Kathy, the body of Maxine Turner, also of Point Pleasant, was never recovered either. Her husband and her niece were also killed in the tragedy. All in all, 44 bodies were pulled out of the Ohio River. The last one was discovered by fishermen 6 months after the tragedy and far downstream. Maxine and Kathy are the only ones who remain unaccounted for, which leaves the total death toll at 46. The accident wiped out entire families and shattered communities. The small town of Point Pleasant had about 6,000 residents in 1967, and 15 of them died when the Silver Bridge came down. Across the river, Canoga, Ohio was part of the larger town of Gallipolis, but even this was home to only around 7,500 residents. 11 passed away in the disaster. Many people knew someone who had died, and almost everyone shared the trauma of watching the horrific event unfold. Okay, the cause of the disaster. So what had caused all of this? What had exacted such a heavy toll upon communities either side of the Ohio, seemingly without warning? Mechanically speaking, the culprit was one of the bridge's eye bars. An eye bar is quite simply a length of steel used in the construction of a suspension bridge. It has a rounded hole at each end, known as an eye. These eye bars were linked in sequence with pins that slotted through each eye. At the joint between two eye bars, a suspension cable connected the chain to the bridge's deck below. The eye bar in question was the first one between the West Tower and the Ohio side of the river. A collection of tiny cracks had formed in the bar around the eye joint. One of these cracks had grown and perhaps combined with others to form a much larger flaw. The bitterly cold temperatures combined with the brittleness of high-strength steel were a dangerous mix. As rush hour traffic filled the bridge, the bar could no longer take the strain. It shattered dramatically. This was the source of the sound described by witnesses as like a shotgun blast or a sonic boom. It's also where the sudden lurch began within the bridge's structure, resulting in a dangerous shift to its load. Even when the eye bar snapped, the loads at work were still well within the bridge's rated range. However, these ratings were for static loads, a gradual application of force as part of the bridge's normal operation. The ratings were not for dynamic or shock loads, a sudden transference of force from one position to another. This is exactly what happened when the eye bar shattered, and the results were catastrophic. As the failure took place on the north side of the bridge's span, the north lane fell first, pulling the south lane down behind it. The structure was essentially flipped. Rather than sinking down into the water, the bridge's deck was wrenched to the north, creating a twisting motion that crumpled pier girders, cars, and people indiscriminately. So this was the mechanical failure that caused the disaster. But why was this allowed to happen? The Silver Bridge had been completed in 1928, so it was close to 40 years old in December '67. For the first 13 years of its service, private landowners had conducted inspections until the bridge was sold to the state of West Virginia in 1941. From then on, the state handled inspections. In 1965, inspectors found numerous problems with the bridge, recommending around $30,000 worth of repairs, more than $300,000 today. These repairs were carried out and completed by 1967. Records suggest the bridge had been inspected again just 1 week before the tragedy took place. Evidently, this was not enough. In the years following the disaster, investigators went to enormous lengths to find out why so many inspections had missed the bridge's fatal flaw. They were able to reconstruct the bridge, pulling around 90% of its pieces out of the water and reassembling them on the land. They deemed that the eye bar in question was too high in the bridge's structure to be easily inspected. What's more, the flaw was embedded in the eye itself and therefore invisible without taking the thing apart. This was a sobering conclusion. The Silver Bridge had passed inspection after inspection and had only recently been repaired. These repairs and inspections weren't enough to prevent this tragedy. Suddenly, Americans from coast to coast were left worrying about the safety and security of their own commutes and the bridges they and their loved ones crossed over every single day. America's highway network could be putting millions of lives at risk. Something had to change. Regulatory changes. To his credit, President Lyndon Johnson acted almost immediately. He created a task force charged with surveying bridge safety and auditing current inspections and repair procedures. This was followed by the National Bridge Inspection Standard, or NBIS, in 1968. Astonishingly, this was the first time a federal standard had been introduced for bridge maintenance and safety. Before the Point Pleasant collapse, nationwide standards just weren't deemed necessary. Individual states implemented their own rules, many of them woefully out of date. A driver traveling from Portland, Maine to Schenectady, New York could pass through 4 different states in less than 250 miles, each with its own set of bridge safety standards. As it turns out, the federal code was absolutely necessary. The first wave of inspections under the new NBIS benchmark found numerous instances of cracking steel girders, all of which had put lives at risk. A national bridge inspection program was passed into law with the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1968. This meant that fractures and cracks in difficult-to-reach areas were no longer an excuse. The Act outlined specific procedures for inspecting hidden components, including those below waterline. These sweeping changes were crucial. Structures like the Silver Bridge and many others across the country were known as Model T bridges. In other words, they were designed with the Ford Model T motor car in mind. The Model T weighed around 1,500 pounds, or 680 kilos. By 1967, the average family car weighed around 4,000 pounds, that's 1,814 kilos or more. As for freight, West Virginia law back in 1928 prohibited any vehicle with a gross weight above 20,000 pounds, or 9,071 kilos. By 1967, this upper limit was 60,800, more than 27,500 kilos. Until the legislative changes of 1968, the United States was unknowingly sitting on a ticking time bomb, a set of bridges and flyovers that were groaning under loads they'd never been designed for. It was just a matter of time before one of those structures collapsed, seemingly without warning, taking dozens of lives with it. In the end, fate chose the Point Pleasant Bridge on December 15, 1967, and 46 people died as a result. But not everyone believed that the Silver Bridge disaster was quite so unexpected. In 1975, cryptid and UFO researcher John Keel published The Mothman Prophecies, a book that would become a bestseller, spawning a hit movie more than 25 years later. The book focuses on the eponymous Mothman, a sort of bizarre bat-owl-moth-human hybrid supposedly lurking in the woods around West Virginia and Ohio. The freakish creature with glowing red eyes was first spotted in November 1966, either by a team of gravediggers or by a group of local teenagers, depending on which story you prefer. The sightings then continued over the following year, with dozens of people reporting an encounter with the bizarre animal around the Point Pleasant area. With the collapse of the Silver Bridge, the sightings abruptly ceased. Were people encountering a strange interdimensional being in the woods of West Virginia? Doubtful. Were they instead seeing a large barn owl, another nocturnal bird, or nothing at all? Most likely. And was this creature trying to warn people about the impending disaster on the Point Pleasant Bridge? Almost certainly not. The Mothman theory is an interesting yarn, and it has really captured the imagination. There's even a museum in Point Pleasant dedicated to it, but it's nothing more than a nice bit of local folklore. Instead of worrying about magical prophetic beasties roaming nearby woodlands, it's probably more useful to focus on making sure bridges can actually handle the loads placed upon them.
Conclusion, an ongoing fact.
In 2017, half a century after the Silver Bridge catastrophe, Brandy L. Hendrickson, Federal Highway Administrator, addressed a crowd in West Virginia. The Silver Bridge collapse was a national wake-up call and inspired a much more aggressive effort to inspect and maintain bridges across the country, she said. This tragedy propelled the nation into an era of bridge safety. There's truth in Hendrickson's words, but perhaps she should have said an era of relative bridge safety. Unfortunately, the Silver Bridge was not the last United States bridge to collapse under the strain of regular operation. Perhaps the most famous recent example is the I-35W bridge in Minneapolis, which came down in 2007 after a steel gusset plate ripped apart. 13 people lost their lives. Known as Bridge 9340, the structure opened for business in November 1967, just 1 month before the Silver Bridge collapsed into the Ohio. This meant Bridge 9340 had been subject to 40 years of NBIS grade testing and still fell victim to a faulty component. In 2017, a survey of the United States bridges found that around 40% were 50 years or older. In other words, they were built before the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1968. Around 9.1% of bridges in the US were found to be structurally deficient. This translates to more than 56,000 bridges across the country and an enormous number of lives put at risk. West Virginia was found to be one of the worst states for this, with more than 17% of its bridges deemed deficient. This is not quite the disaster it sounds like. We're not talking about bridges hanging by a thread ready to collapse any second. Instead, we're talking about structures that need significant work to bring them into line. The 2017 report cited a maintenance backlog that would cost $123 billion to fix. With cars getting heavier year on year, and with increasing congestion on America's roads, the cost is likely to be quite a bit higher now. Of course, this is not a surprise. When President Johnson announced his legislative changes back in 1968, he knew it wasn't going to be a quick fix. Instead, it was always going to be an ongoing battle, a struggle without end. I hope the people who lost loved ones in the collapse can take some degree of comfort in knowing that a lot of good came out of this tragedy, said Tracy W. Brown, District Bridge Engineer for the West Virginia Division of Highways in 2017. A lot of lives have been saved across the country since December 15, 1967. Brown is of course right, but the fight is still not over. And stories like that of Howard Bogg, who survived the Silver Bridge collapse, only to discover his wife and baby daughter did not, remind us of just how high the stakes can be when inspectors get it wrong.